Continuing Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. I don't know why it's cutting off 3 minutes from the potential video, but we're in program E of Themistocles. But after the sentence and banishment of Themistocles, Themistocles reviles him yet more immoderately and wildly in the poem that begins thus: "Unto all the Greeks repair, O Muse, and tell these verses there, as is fitting and is fair." The story that it was put to the question whether Themistocles should be banished for siding with the Persians, and Themistocles gave his vote against him. So when Themistocles was accused of intriguing with the Medes, Themistocles made these lines upon him: "So now, Themistocles indeed is not the sole friend of the Mede. There are some knaves besides. Nor is it only mine that fails, but other foxes have lost their tails." When the citizens of Athens began to listen willingly to those who traduced and reproached him, he was forced, with somewhat obnoxious frequency, to put them in mind of the great services he had performed, and ask those who were offended with him whether they were weary with receiving benefits often from the same person, so rendering himself more odious, and he yet more provoked the people by building a temple to Diana, with the epithet of Aristobule, or Diana of the best counsel, intimating thereby that he had given the best counsel not only to the Athenians, but to all Greece. He built this temple near his own house in the district called Melite, where now the public officers carry out the bodies of such as are executed, and throw the halters and clothes of those that are strangled and otherwise put to death. There is to this day a small figure of Themistocles in the temple of Diana of best counsel, which represents him to be a person not only of a noble mind, but also of a most heroic aspect. At length, the Athenians banished him, making use of the ostracism to humble his eminence and authority, as they ordinarily did with all whom they thought too powerful, or by their greatness disproportionate to the equality thought requisite in a popular government. For the ostracism was instituted not so much to punish the offender as to mitigate and pacify the violence of the envious, who delighted to humble eminent men, and who, by fixing this disgrace upon them, might vent some part of their rancor. Themistocles being banished from Athens, while he stayed at Argos, the detection of Pausanias happened, which gave such advantage to his enemies that Leobates of Agraul, son of Alcmaon, indicted him of treason, the Spartans supporting him in the accusation. Well, such is the thing of how the war and politics often go. It's often has nothing to do with actual policies and statistics involved of what they actually were part of, but the fates of fortune otherwise of what they can, When Pausanias went about this treasonable design, he concealed it at first from Themistocles, though he were his intimate friend. But when he saw him expelled of the commonwealth, and how impatiently he took his banishment, he ventured to communicate it to him, and desired his assistance, showing him the king of Persia's letters, and exasperating him against the Greeks as a villainous, ungrateful people. However, Themistocles immediately rejected the proposals of Pausanias, and wholly refused to be a party in the enterprise, though he never revealed his communications, nor disclosed the conspiracy to any man, either hoping that Pausanias would desist from his intentions, or expecting that so inconsiderate an attempt after such chimerical objects would be discovered by other means. And yeah, people lying and making accusations against others rather than showing their actual strength and getting something of value done has long been a thing of politics, hasn't it? I'm sure it goes way like back before the Sumerians and stuff too. After that, Pausanias was put to death, letters and writings being found concerning this matter, which rendered Themistocles suspected. The Lacedaemonians were clamorous against him, and his enemies among the Athenians accused him, when, being absent from Athens, he made his defense by letters, especially against the points that had been previously alleged against him, in answer to the malicious detractions of his enemies. He merely wrote to the citizens, urging that he who was always ambitious to govern, and not of a character or disposition to serve, would never sell himself and his country into slavery to a barbarous and hostile nation. Notwithstanding this, the people, being persuaded by his accusers, sent officers to take him and bring him away to be tried before a council of the Greeks. But having timely notice of it, he passed over into the island of Corcyra, where the state was under obligations to him for being chosen as arbitrator in a difference between them and the Corinthians. He decided the controversy by ordering the Corinthians to pay down 20 talents, and declaring the town and island of Leucas to a joint a joint colony from both cities. From thence he fled into Epirus, and the Athenians and Lacedaemonians still pursuing him, he threw himself upon chances of safety that seemed all but desperate, for he fled for refuge to Admetus, king of the Molossians, who had formerly made some request to the Athenians when Themistocles was in the height of his authority, and had been disdainfully used and insulted by him, and had let it appear plain enough that he could lay hold of him. He would take his revenge. Yet, in the misfortune, Themistocles, fearing the recent hatred of his neighbors and fellow citizens more than the old displeasure of the king, put himself at his mercy and became an humble suppliant to Admetus, after a particular manner different from the custom of other countries. For taking the king's son, who was then a child, in his arms, he laid himself down at his hearth, this being the most sacred and only manner of supplication among the Molossians, which was not to be refused. And some say that his wife Thea intimated to Themistocles this way of petitioning, and placed her young son with him before the hearth. Others, that King Admetus, that he might be under a religious obligation not to deliver him to his pursuers, prepared and enacted with him a sort of stage play to this effect. At this time Epicrates of Acarnah privately conveyed his wife and children out of Athens and sent them hither, for which afterwards Cimon condemned him and put him to death, as Stesibratus reports, and yet somehow, either forgetting this himself or making Themistocles to be a little mindful of it, says presently that he sailed into Sicily and desired in marriage the daughter of Hero, tyrant of Syracuse, promising to bring the Greeks under his power, and on Hero refusing him, departed thence into Asia. But this is not probable, and we don't mean Asia in terms of the continent. Whether you start that with like Turkey going east, or whether you start that on the other side of Afghanistan, it's still not what we're talking about. We're just talking about the one little area of the Mediterranean there. 4. Theophrastus writes in his work on monarchy that when Hero sent racehorses to the Olympian Games and erected a pavilion sumptuously furnished, Themistocles made an oration to the Greeks, inciting them to pull down the tyrant's tent and not to suffer his horses to run. Thucydides says that passing overland to the Aegean Sea, he took ship at Pudna in the bay Therme, not being known to anyone in the ship, till, being terrified to see the vessel driven by the winds near to Naxos, which was then besieged by the Athenians, he made himself known to the master and pilot, and partly entreating them, partly threatening that if they went on shore he would accuse them, and make the Athenians to believe that they did not take him in out of ignorance, but that they had corrupted them with money from the beginning. He compelled them to bear off and stand out to sea and sail forward towards the coast of Asia, of Asia. The distinguishing by the pronunciation is gonna be easier, right? A greater part of his estate was privately conveyed away by his friends and sent after him by sea into Asia, besides which there was discovered and confiscated to the value of 80 talents, as Theophrastus writes. Theopompus says, in 100, though Themistocles was never worth 3 talents before he was concerned in public affairs. When he arrived at Cum and understood that all along the coast there were many laid wait for him, and particularly Ergoteles and Pythagoras were, for the game was worth the hunting for such as were thankful to make money by any means, the king of Persia, having offered by public proclamation 200 talents to him that should take him, he fled to Aga, a small city of the Aeolians, where no one knew him but only his host, Nicogenes, who was the richest man in Aeolia, and well known to the great men of Inner Asia. Well, Themistocles lay hid for some days in his house one night, after sacrifice and supper ensuing. Olbius, the attendant upon Nicogenes's children, fell into a sort of frenzy and fit of inspiration, and cried out in verse, "Night shall speak, and night instruct thee. By the voice of night conduct thee." After this, Themistocles, going to bed, dreamed that he saw a snake coil itself up upon his belly, and so creep to his neck. Then, as soon as it touched his face, it turned into an eagle. And did not show up on them, and did not appear on a Mexican flag, right? Which spread its wings over him, and took him up and flew away with him a great distance. Then there appeared a herald's golden wand, and upon this at last it set him down securely after infinite terror and disturbance. His departure was effected by Nicodemus by the following artifice: the barbarous nations, and amongst them the Persians especially, are extremely jealous, severe, and suspicious about their women, not only their wives, but also their bought slaves and concubines, whom they keep so strictly that no one ever sees them abroad. They spend their lives shut up within doors, and when they take a journey, are carried in closed tents, curtained in on all sides, and set upon a wagon. Such a travelling carriage being prepared for Themistocles, they hid him in it, and carried him on his journey, and told those whom they met or spoke with about the road that they were conveying a young Greek woman out of Ionia to a nobleman at court. Thucydides and Charon of Lampsacus says that Xerxes was dead, and that Themistocles had an interview with his son, but Ephorus, Dinon, Plutarch, Heraclitus, and many others write that he came to Xerxes. The chronological tables better agree with the account of Thucydides, and yet neither can their statements be said to be quite set at rest. When Themistocles was come to the critical point, he applied himself first to Artabanus, commander of 1,000 men, telling him that he was a Greek and desired to speak with the king about important affairs concerning which the king was extremely solicitous. Artabanus answered him, O stranger, the laws of men are different, and one thing is honorable to one man, and to others another, but it is honorable for all to honor and observe their own laws. It is the habit of the Greeks, we are told, to honor above all things liberty and equality, but amongst our many excellent laws we account this the most excellent, to honor the king and to worship him as the image of the great preserver of the universe. If then ye shall consent to our laws, and fall down before the king and worship him, you may see him and speak to him. But if your mind be otherwise, you must make use of others to intercede for you, for it is not the national custom here for the king to give audience to any one that doth not fall down before him. Far have they gone from the Zoroastrian ideals, right? Themistocles, hearing this, replied, Artabanus, I that come hither to increase the power and glory of the king will not only submit myself to his law, since it hath pleased the entity who exalteth the Persian Empire to this greatness, but will also cause many more to be worshippers and adorers of the king. Let not this, therefore, be an impediment why I should not communicate to the king what I have to impart. Artabanus asking him, Who must we tell him that you are? For your words signify you to be no ordinary person. Themistocles answered, No man, Artabanus, must be informed of this before the king himself. Thus Fannius relates, to which Eratosthenes, in his treatise on riches, adds that it was by the means of a woman of Eretria, who was kept by Artabanus, that he obtained this audience and interview with him. When he was introduced to the king and had paid his reverence to him, he stood silent till the king commanding the interpreter to ask him who he was, he replied, O king, I am Themistocles, the Athenian, driven into banishment by the Greeks. The evils that I have done to the Persians are numerous, but my benefits to them yet greater in withholding the Greeks from pursuit so soon as the deliverance of my own country allowed me to show kindness also to you. I come with a mind suited for my present calamities, prepared alike for favors and for anger, to welcome your gracious reconciliation and to depreciate your wrath. Take my own countrymen for witness of the services I have done for Persia, and make use of this occasion to show the world your virtue, rather than to satisfy your indignation. If you save me, you will save your suppliant; if otherwise, will destroy an enemy of the Greeks. He talked also of the divine admonitions, such as the vision which he saw at Nicogenes' house, and the directions given him by the oracle of Dodona, where Jupiter commanded him to go to him, that he had a name like his, by which he understood that he was sent from Jupiter to him, seeing that they were both great and had the names of kings. Now, remember, biblically, in what they call the Old New Testament, Melchizedek is the king of Jupiter. That's what it means, King Jupiter. Sovereign, righteous sovereign, also. But yeah, the king heard him attentively, and though he admired his temper and courage, gave him no answer at that time, but when he was with his intimate friends, rejoiced in his great good fortune, and esteemed himself very happy in this, and prayed to his Artemanius that all his enemies might ever be of the same mind with the Greeks, to abuse and expel the bravest men amongst them. Then he sacrificed to the entities, and presently fell to drinking, and was so pleased that in the night, in the middle of his sleep, he cried out for joy 3 times, I have Themistocles, the Athenian. In the morning, calling together the chief of his court, he had Themistocles brought before him, who expected no good of it, when he saw, for example, the guards fiercely set against him as soon as they learnt his name, and giving him ill language, as he came forward towards the king, who was seated, the rest keeping silence, passing by Oxanas, a commander of 1,000 men, he heard him with a slight groan say, without stirring out of his place, You subtle Greek serpent, the king's good genius hath brought thee thither. Yet when he came into the presence and again fell down, the king saluted him and spake to him kindly, telling him he was now indebted to him 200 talents, for it was just and reasonable that he should receive the reward which was proposed to whosoever should bring Themistocles, and promising much more, and encouraging him, he commanded him to speak freely what he would concerning the affairs of Greece. Themistocles replied that a man's discourse was like to a rich Persian carpet, the beautiful figures and patterns of which can only be shown by spreading and extending it out. When it is contracted and folded up, they are obscure and lost, and therefore he desired time, the king being pleased with the comparison, and bidding him take what time he would, he desired a year, in which time, having learnt the Persian language sufficiently, he spoke with the king by himself without the help of an interpreter, it being supposed that he discoursed only about the affairs of Greece, but there happening at the same time great alterations at court, and removals of the king's favorites, he drew upon himself the envy of the great people, who imagined that he had taken the boldness to speak concerning them. For the favors shown to other strangers were nothing in comparison with the honors conferred on him. The king invited him to partake of his own pastimes and recreations, both at home and abroad, carrying him with him a-hunting, and made him his intimate so far that he permitted him to see the queen mother and converse frequently with her. By the king's command he also was made acquainted with the Magian learning, the priests of Persia, which it wasn't just religious learning. It was in an explicit sense, it was a science thing too. Which, unlike what we hear in Christianity and Judaism, sciences and philosophy and all that's the same path with other faiths for the most part. When Demaratus, the Lacedaemonian, being ordered by the king to ask whatsoever he pleased, that it should immediately be granted him, desired that he might make his public entrance, and be carried into the state through the city of Sardis, with a tiara set in the royal manner upon his head. Mithridates, cousin of the king, touched him on the head, and told him that he had no brains for the royal tiara to cover, and if Jupiter should give him his lightning and thunder, he would not any more be Jupiter for that. The king also repulsed him with anger, resolving never to be reconciled to him, but to be inexorable to all supplications on his behalf. Yet Themistocles pacified him and prevailed with him to forgive him, and it is reported that the succeeding kings, in whose reigns there was a greater communication between the Greeks and Persians, when they invited any considerable Greek into their service, to encourage him, would write and promise him that he should be as great with them as Themistocles had been. They related also how Themistocles, when he was in great prosperity and courted by many, seeing himself splendidly served at his table, turned to his children and said, "Children, we have been undone if we had not been undone." Most writers say that he had 3 cities given him: Magnesia, Laus, and Lampsacus, to maintain him in bread, meat, and wine. Neanthes of Cyzicus and Phanius add 2 more: the city of Pelascepsis, to provide him with clothes, and Percote with bedding and furniture for his house. As he was going down towards the sea coast to take measures against Greece, a Persian, whose name was Epixas, governor of the Upper Phrygia, laid wait to kill him, having for that purpose provided a long time before a number of Pisidians who were set upon him when he should stop to rest at a city that is called Lion's Head. But Themistocles, sleeping in the middle of the day, saw the mother of the entities appear to him in a dream, and say to him, "Themistocles, keep back from the Lion's Head, for fear you fall into the lion's jaws. For this advice I expect that your daughter Nesiptalema should be my servant." Themistocles was much astonished, and when he had made his vows to the female entity, left the broad road, and making a circuit, went another way, changing his intended station to avoid that place, and at night took up his rest in the fields. But one of the sumpter horses, which carried the furniture for his tent, having fallen that day into the river, his servants spread out tapestry, which was wet, and hung it up to dry. In the meantime the Pisidians made towards them with their swords drawn, and not discerning exactly by the moon what it was that was stretched out, thought it be the tent of Themistocles, and that they should find him resting himself within it. But when they came near and lifted up the hangings, those who watched there fell upon them, and took them. Themistocles, having escaped this great danger, in admiration of the female entity and her goodness that appeared to him, built in memory of it a temple in the city of Magnesia, which is dedicated to Dindamene, mother of the entities, in which he consecrated and devoted his daughter Mnistothelema to her service.